مارس الموافق 4 إلى 6 جمادى الأول، فقط وحصريا على قناة ديوان. تابعوا معنا تغطية مباشرة لمنتدى جدة الاقتصادي في الأوقات التالية: السبت من 8 مساء وحتى 10:30 ليلا، الأحد من 1 ظهرا وحتى 6:30 مساء، الاثنين من 1 ظهرا وحتى 6:30 مساء. منتدى جدة الاقتصادي 2013 يأتيكم برعاية قناة ديوان، رصد مستمر ومباشر لنشاط الأعمال.
وحلول مبتكرة للقطاع الخاص في مجال تمويل الإسكان. سيدير هذه الجلسة السيد ديفيد سميث المؤسس لمؤسسة الإسكان بأسعار معقولة من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وسيشارك فيها كل من سعادة الشيخ صالح عبد الله كامل رئيس مجلس إدارة الغرفة التجارية والصناعية بجدة ورئيس المنتدى، أيضا الدكتور سعيد بن عبد الله الشيخ نائب الرئيس التنفيذي وكبير الاقتصاديين في البنك الأهلي التجاري، والسيد بلوبي كيرتانافاج النائب الأول لرئيس بنك الإسكان بحكومة تايلاند ومدير البحوث وإدارة خدمات المعلومات، وأيضا السيد فيلغاندر رئيس قسم خدمات استشارات الأعمال في الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا في شركة أرنست أند يونغ. فقط نشير إلى أن هذه الجلسة ستعرض على قناة ديوان وكذلك الجلسات المتبقية لهذا اليوم. أترك الميكروفون الآن للسيد ديفيد سميث.
In the last session, we heard about the development side of the equation, how you create new housing. This panel is about the finance side of the equation, how you fund the housing. And it seems to me the simplest thing to do is to yield the floor to Sheikh Salah. All yours. Go.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله الذي جعل الزكاة الركن الثالث في الإسلام ليكون هو الرقيب علينا في أداء هذا الركن المالي الهام، الذي وإن كان ركنا تعبديا فهو كذلك لأهميته الاقتصادية. فالزكاة يا إخواني خطة اقتصادية متكاملة للأسف لم نفهمها في هذا العصر ولم نطبقها التطبيق السليم الذي يحقق الأغراض التي أرادها الله سبحانه وتعالى من وراء هذا الركن المهم. فالزكاة تتدخل في موضوع الإسكان، والزكاة تتدخل في موضوع تخطيط المدن، لأنه لو طبقناها ولو اعتبرنا هذه الملايين من الأراضي المملوكة البيضاء عروض تجارة، وهي حتما عروض تجارة سواء كانت مملوكة بالثمن أو بالمنح، لابد أن تزكى هذه الأراضي في كل عام بنسبة 2.5% كعروض التجارة في أي شيء، ولا يعفى من الزكاة إلا الأراضي الضمار. الأراضي الضمار هي التي فيها عيب في ذاتها لا تصلح للبيع بسببه. أما الأرض الضخمة الكبيرة التي أملكها ولا أزكيها وأقول أنها ليست للتجارة، أنا لست صادقا مع الله في ذلك، لأنه لا يوجد شخص يتملك ملايين الأمتار للاستخدام الشخصي، إلا يعفى القنية الشخصية. لا يمكن أن أتحجج أنه ليست للتجارة. وسمعنا بالأمس اقتراحات من أصحاب المعالي الوزراء ومن المتحدثين أنه قد يفرض رسوم، وأنا أقول إنه نحن لدينا آلية مالية ليست مبتكرة، فهي موجودة من 1400 عام. عنوان الجلسة هذه الجلسة هو حلول مالية مبتكرة. أنا الواقع وجدت إنه في تراثنا الإسلامي موجود حلين لمشكلة الأراضي البيضاء، وهي التي تمثل العقبة الكأداء أمام الإسكان. الحل الأهم والذي يجب أن يطبق سنوياً هو الزكاة الشرعية، ولا يمكن لأي أحد أن يقول أن هذه الأرض ليست عروض تجارة، ويجب أن تصدر فتاوى صريحة وواضحة في هذا الموضوع، وأن نطبق الشرع الذي نفخر بأننا في هذه البلاد ولله الحمد نطبق الشرع. فهذه الوسيلة سهلة وستجعل المدن تتمدد بالتدريج، ولا نجد جزر بيضاء في المدن الرئيسية، بقعة عمران ثم أرض كبيرة تعطل العمران وتؤثر على أسعار الأراضي وتكلف الحكومة مرافق أساسية، وتجري الحكومة ورانا إلى آخر الدنيا بالمرافق الأساسية، بينما الجزر الكبيرة اللي في أوساط المدن طالعوا في الرياض وطالعوا في جدة، طالعوا في معظم المدن الرئيسية، نحن عبارة عن بقع متناثرة. الفرد لا يملك أن يتحكم في أرضه ويعطل العمران بهذا الشكل. وسيد الخلق سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم عندما منح أحد الصحابة أرضا كبيرة، وجاء بعده أمير المؤمنين الفاروق عمر بن الخطاب، فقال لذلك الصحابي: لقد منحك رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم هذه الأرض لإعمارها، خذ ما تستطيع أن تعمره ورد الباقي، وأعادها. فلقد منح أفضل الخلق صلى الله عليه وسلم، ولقد أعاد الأرض أمير المؤمنين الفاروق عمر بن الخطاب. فلدينا الزكاة ولدينا الإعمار. الحكمة في منح الأراضي هي للإعمار، فمن لم يعمر فقد الحكمة الذي منح من أجلها. وإذا كنا نطبق الشرع فيجب أن نطبقه في جميع مناحي حياتنا. لذلك أنا أعتقد أن الإسلام نظر للعدالة الاجتماعية وللتنمية وللأفراد قويهم وضعيفهم، ووضع كل الضوابط اللازمة لذلك. فأيها الإخوان والأخوات، يجب أن نتمعن في ديننا الحكيم، ويجب أن نفهمه كما ينبغي وأن نطبقه كما ينبغي حكاما ومحكومين. وأكتفي بهذا القدر وأترك الكلام لزملائي الآخرين.
That is in real estate terms. I cannot speak to the terms in Islam. But in real estate terms, what Sheikh Saleh just proposed is remarkable for Saudi Arabia. It's not remarkable for the developed world. In my hometown, a business will pay 3 or 4 or 5% of its real estate value every year as real estate taxes. Every year I, as a homeowner, pay 2% of the value of my house as real estate taxes. If housing in America or the UK is developed for low-income people, it pays less tax. It can be an exempt purpose. If housing is developed for very poor people, it pays no tax. So it is in general a principle of developed economies that land which is used for business purpose is taxed. Whether that's in the form of tax or zakat, I leave to you, but I find Sheikh Saleh's suggestion, he's absolutely right. It's a profound change that would have a profound impact on the creation and growth of Saudi Arabian cities. And so I commend you, sir, for suggesting it. Now, at the same time, we've heard before about the role of the banking sector. And indeed, if developers and owners give back to the community, the banking sector no less gives back to the community. And some of the ways it accomplishes that is through private banks or partially government banks, or in the case of Thailand, a fully government bank. So my good friend Balab Kritayanavad, the Senior Vice President for Government of GHB, will explain very briefly how the Thai Government Housing Bank evolved from a purely governmental entity to an entity that, even though it is owned by the government, is highly entrepreneurial and highly commercially successful. So Mr. Balab, the floor is yours. You can do it sitting or you can do it standing. Take your choice.
Thank you, David. Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I am very much excited to be here for the first time in the glorious Islamic Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the land of origin of Islam and the spreading of Islamic civilization throughout the Middle East and various parts of the world, including Thailand. Thailand have about 10 million Muslims. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Sheikh Saleh Kamel for inviting me to be here in the growing and prosperous city of Jeddah, the gateway to the holy city of Makkah and Medina. It is my pleasure and honor to be a part of Jeddah Economic Forum today to share our experience on housing the growing population, which is very timely and important issue, since the provision of adequate and affordable housing has been a growing challenging issue for many countries in the MENA region, including Saudi Arabia. Thailand is a mid-sized country in Southeast Asia. The present population is about 67 million, more than twice of Saudi Arabia. During the past decades, Thailand's population growth has slowed to less than 1% per year. However, population in the urban areas increased very rapidly at the rate more than 4% per year. Firstly, our urbanization rate is about 45% compared to only 30% in 1990. Thailand economic grew impressively to 6.5% last year and we continue to grow at more than 5% this year. The GDP per capita is about 6,300 US dollar, which is nearly 4 times less than Saudi Arabia. However, Thailand enjoys one of the lowest unemployment rate at less than 1% at the present time. Thailand used to face with a huge housing shortage and a large number of slum housing, particularly in Bangkok metropolitan region. However, we have overcome this problem. Thailand has successfully provided adequate and affordable housing for the last 2 decades. Our government has always focused its policy on providing affordable housing, especially to lower and middle income group of people. Thailand home ownership rate is currently about 80%, one of the highest in the world, compared to 67% in the US, 65% in UK, yeah, and we currently have no serious housing shortage or housing backlog or shortfall. Unlike many other countries in the MENA region, we even experience the huge oversupply in Bangkok metropolitan region during the year 1995 to 1997. At that time, our bank conducted research and found that more than 300,000 units were sold to the home buyer, but it's what can nobody occupy them. So housing in Thailand have been provided by both government and private sector. During the past 4 decades, the National Housing Authority is the key government agency that produces affordable housing to mainly low-income group of people. A total of 800,000 units, low-cost housing units, were completed since its establishment. And readily available market housing is on sale to all income group of people. Most of them are provided by private developer purely on commercial basis. Housing development in Thailand are very efficient in producing housing for sale in the market. During 5 years booming period of 1993 to 1997, private housing developer could complete around 800,000 units in Bangkok alone, an average of about 160,000 units per year, equivalent to 40 years production of the National Housing Authority. New housing unit completion were adjusted to about 500,000 units during the last 5 years, reflecting a more balanced market demand and supply. The Thai housing developers are currently afraid of oversupply rather than inadequate demand. Actually, they can produce any number of housing units that the buyers demand or they can afford to buy. Currently, there are about 1,000 housing developers operate in Bangkok metropolitan region. One of the big company announced this year to produce more than 10,000 units. And another company, they pronounced to build 80 projects nationwide. As for housing finance, I would like to say that Thailand financial system is very supportive to home ownership. Many loans, home loan to GDP in Thailand is currently about 20%. And home loan to on loan is about 16%. Housing finance system has operated very efficiently. Home loan outstanding expands steadily at the rate of about 12% per year during the last decades. Home loans are always available, accessible, and affordable to all income group. Private commercial bank and the government housing bank are the two key lenders in the Thai housing finance system. They are compete fiercely in providing home loan to the Thai home buyers. Currently, commercial banks have the market share about 60%, where the government housing bank about 31%. So the last individual holder of mortgage loan in Thailand. Jeddah Bank was established 60 years ago in 1953 under the Ministry of Finance as a special purpose financial institution. The bank has played a key role in providing affordable home loan to middle and low income family. The bank received no government subsidy from the Ministry of Finance. So we have to compete with other banks in both funding and lending in the free financial market. However, the bank has successfully mobilized funds from general public to continuously expand its mortgage lending to home buyers throughout the country, helping more than many millions to have their own home. Currently, the bank is serving more than 1.5 million families nationwide through more than 100 branches. The bank offers home loan to all income groups. However, we concentrate on low-income family. More than 80% of all the bank accounts are less than 1 million baht, or equivalent to about 1,025,000 Saudi Riyal, which is considered as low-income loan. The overall average house price in Bangkok for sale in the market is about 360,000 Saudi Riyal, while government housing bank average price used as collateral for mortgage loan is only 175,000 Riyal. The government housing banks provide the lowest lending rate to home buyers compared to any other commercial bank. But our depositing rate normally higher than commercial bank. As such, the bank still operate profitably. The bank is also the leader in extending loan repayment period up to 30 years and increase loan to value ratio up to 90% on 100%. That means down payment only 10% or no down payment. This is to assist low-income home buyer to better access and afford home loan throughout the country. Thank you.
I was struck in Balab's excellent presentation, and I apologize, Balab, time does press no matter how much we try to stretch it out, how GHB, though it is a government bank, has no monopoly. It competes with private banks, and indeed it is not the dominant bank in the marketplace. It's only 31% of the marketplace. So it's competing, I suspect, by expanding the frontier of lending downward, by using its government borrowing power for lower rates, taking a little more risk with a higher loan-to-value ratio, and in general expanding the supply of buyers. And it is doing that it's worth underscoring what Balab said, with no direct government subsidy. So in light of that, Dr. Saeed Al-Sheikh, what is the state of finance in Saudi Arabia? What is commercially viable? Where does affordability lie? Do you want to speak up here or from your seat?
I can speak from the podium.
Okay. So Dr. Saeed Al-Sheikh, Chief Economist, National Commercial Bank.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. David, thank you very much, and also I extend my appreciation to the Jeddah Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to speak at this forum, this very important topic that we're discussing today. Just briefly, before I answer the questions that was put to me by David regarding financing options, especially as it relates to the Saudi banking sector, I would like to highlight few important issues related to the housing, especially as the determinants of the housing. We know that the population of Saudi Arabia is growing at 3.1%. The labor force is growing at 4%. Also, there is an improvement in purchasing power. The GDP per capita is reaching $24,000 per capita. Also, we're noticing a cultural change, a shift in the family size. People are shifting from the extended family to a single family. That in itself is creating demand on housing. So these issues are very important as we address the issue of housing. And I would come to the issue of affordability. And as we know, and as Sheikh Saleh has mentioned earlier, the cost of the land is constituting a large component of housing. It accounts for nearly 50% in cities such as Jeddah and Riyadh, and even more in some locations. Even in smaller cities, it reaches 30 to 40%. Worldwide average is 20 to 30%. In the US, it's close to 30%, the cost of the land. So the cost of the land is making it very hard for people to own their houses. We are aware that the official figures put home ownership at 60%. And this is the figure that was talked about yesterday, was published by the CDS, but I have my doubts on the validity of this number. If we exclude the mud huts and also clay homes, which are also available in the CDS data, then the home ownership of legitimate housing or standard housing would account for nearly 40%. Also, if we look to the inflation over the period between 2008 and 2012, rising at or averaging at 12.4%, that would indicate immediately there is a huge shortage in supply, and it cannot be that the home ownership stands at 60%. So these are important issues. Now, I mentioned GDP per capita when one had to look at the average wage. GDP per capita is not a reflection of disposable income. If we look to average wage of Saudis based on official data released by the General Organization for Social Insurance, the average salary is a monthly salary is about 6,000 Saudi riyals. So we're talking about nearly 70,000, the average annual income. Now, if we look to the cost of the house, the average cost of the house is about 600 to 700,000. So we're talking about cost of the house to the annual income of 10 folds. If we account for a lower dependency than the average home size from 6.2 to nearly 4.4, if we account for that, meaning there is a second generator of income in the household, even if we account for that, that will bring the annual income close to 85,000 Saudi riyals and will put the cost of the house to the annual income close to 7 to 8 times. In the US, the cost of the house to the annual income is close to 3 times. So there is a huge gap. Let me just now highlight the financing requirement. How much financing will be needed in the period between now and 2022? We're estimating there will be a need for 2.4 million housing units with a total cost of 1.3 trillion Saudi riyals. Assuming the historical trend where people use their saving as well as relying on the real estate development fund with some acceleration in the funding provided by the Real Estate Development Fund, the total investment, or as it is referred to as the gross fixed capital formation in the period between 2012 and 2022 will account for nearly 650 billion Saudi riyals. If we add the 250 billion Saudi riyals that were provided for by the royal decree of last year, then the total investment that would be available is close to 900 billion Saudi riyals. So we're falling short by nearly 400 billion Saudi riyals between now and 2022. Obviously, the banks had to play a role, and there is great opportunity for banks to provide financing, especially with the release of the mortgage laws. In the second quarter of 2012, just in the anticipation of the release of the law, financing or funding by banks increased by 17 billion. Residential finance amounted to nearly 48 billion Saudi riyals by mid-year last year. We're expecting total financing by banks to be reaching 115 billion by 2015. There will be an acceleration of funding. The schemes that are available by Saudi banks now, I'm talking about the financing schemes, Ijara, which is preferable by banks as well as by clients or by households. They found that to be more comfortable to them, also with the promise of owning at the end of the period with the settlement of the whole debt. The range for Ijara, the cost of funding for Ijara is close to 3%. Murabaha has been introduced by some of the banks, and just recently by NCB was introduced in providing funding for housing. It goes up to 20 years. As you know, the Murabaha is a sort of a markup arrangement where the bank will buy the house on behalf of the client and then will sell it to the client with a markup, taking care of the deferred payment, the insurance, and other fees and services. The rate that is available in the market now is averaging 4.5, 4.75. Obviously, this is high. We're expecting, with more players coming in the market, to be falling lower. This is a fixed rate, 4.5 to 4.75. Not all banks offer actually this product. Now, if I have time that I can reflect more, 2 minutes? Yeah. Now, if we look to the, housing issue and availability of financing to different income groups, I would identify the market in terms of three different income groups. Low income group, obviously those will be relying more on direct funding provided by the government through the 250 billion Saudi riyals that were offered through the royal decree with the building of 500,000 housing units. Unlikely for those people to be accessing funding provided by banks because of the cost of funding and because of the cost of houses. Now, for middle income group or low to middle income group, more likely they will be utilizing the Real Estate Development Fund, especially that the loan had been increased to 500,000 Saudi riyals. More recently, Real Estate Development Fund realized that the cost of the house is higher than 500,000 riyal and introduced what's called the Vamin funding. It's a supplement funding above the 500,000 Saudi riyals provided by banks, assuming the asset is mortgaged by both the Real Estate Development Fund as well as the bank. And this had helped a lot of people to access bank funding along with the real estate development funding. And even real estate development made it much easier to make their payments falling after individuals satisfy their payments toward the banks. Now, the mid to high income more likely will be benefiting from the mortgage laws that have been released, and we know that the regulatory measures have been released, or three regulatory measures have been released. the real estate financing, the real estate leasing, and also the control and supervision regulatory measures have been released. I reviewed these. I found them to provide an important and a significant balance between the interests of the clients as well as the interests of the institution, the financial institutions. We're still waiting on the mortgage regulatory measures to be released, an enforcement law to be released, which are the most important one to make the first three implementable. With the mortgage and with the enforcement, definitely there will be much more comfort to the individuals as well as to the banks in moving with, such transaction when it comes to have the title of the house in the name of the client, but given that this is mortgaged and the individual will not be able to sell or to do anything until the full payment is settled. There are, of course, many details related to these regulatory measures that have been released. I'll be very happy to answer any of those during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
I come from a background of working for bankers and doing financial transactions. And so where a social reformer would hear a 50% land price of housing and say that's very high, and a affordability advisor would say that if homes cost 6 times or 7 times or 10 times your annual income, that's very unaffordable. I also hear the statistics about how many billion reals it will take to finance all of this new development, and I say there must be a financing opportunity in here. The prior panel focused on the development opportunities and the fact that people do have money to invest and they do have money to spend for housing, provided you give them a housing solution. But we have to connect this all together. We may have all the oil in the world, but we need pipes to make it flow to the surface so we can use it to generate energy. And those pipes in the financing world represent value chains, and they need to be connected up together. And I can think of few people better to connect them together than the head of transaction and advisory services for Ernst & Young EMEA region, Mr. Phil Gandier. Phil, can you make the money flow for us, please?
Well, I'm an accountant, and everybody knows accountants have no money. So thank you, David. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be back with you. His Excellency, the Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey, said this morning in his keynote speech, even with adequate liquidity and demand and supply, that without confidence in the systems, banks don't lend, so investors can't invest, and consumers cannot or will not buy. I've lived in Saudi Arabia now for 20 years. I moved here when I was 3. And over that period, I have seen massive amounts of liquidity being mobilized by not only the public sector, but also by the private or private and public sector on large infrastructure projects. And I've seen, for example, completely private projects go ahead, and there'd be a lot of demand for these. If you think of some of the privatizations of government organizations, massive demand to bid for these. I've seen IPOs that are oversubscribed 10, 20, 30, 40 times, but I've seen some IPOs that have really struggled. And I've seen a lot of projects that are announced that don't go anywhere. And I'd have to say, maybe a similar theme in all of this is one of confidence. When there's confidence in a project, there's massive demand and it happens. When there's confidence in an IPO, there's massive demand and it becomes oversubscribed. So what I'd like to do is maybe look at a specific problem on the financing side. And I don't want to get too tied up in a chart, but if you look at the chart behind me, so what you have is on the top is the developer, and so on the top is the developer, and if you think of someone developing a project, it starts very slowly in the first phase. They start spending money on feasibility and on some planning things, and then there's a big ramp up, and they acquire the land and they start to construct, and then eventually they start to sell, say that's affordable housing or any type of housing project, and they start getting some of their money back. Maybe there's even pre-sales and they get it back earlier. But somewhere in that red circle, they're going to need financing. And if they can't see that financing coming in, the project's not going to go ahead. And similarly on the bottom, now you've got the demand side, and that's the consumer who's going to be the off-taker, who's going to buy his houses. But there's going to be no demand for his houses if there's no confidence in the consumer and he can't get a mortgage because the confidence is not there that he's going to repay that loan. So what I've seen in working with private sector developers whose projects can't get off the ground, we have two problems. We have one, they're having trouble getting financing from the banks because there's a lack of confidence that their project is ultimately going to be sold, that if they're producing 100 houses or 1,000 houses, there'll be enough demand, there'll be enough citizens who can get loans to acquire those houses. And similarly, it gets down to the confidence that can these consumers afford to pay back a loan if the banks give them a loan? So again, it's a little bit of a confidence game, and for the sake of time, I was going to go into a little bit of a case study, but I'll just describe the Canadian experience to you, if I could. In 1945, when the veterans were returning from World War II, you had tens of thousands of veterans that were coming back, coming into the cities. You had a massive urbanization type problem, and all of these people needed affordable housing. And some of them could not afford to pay like others. So that doesn't sound too unlike the situation in Saudi Arabia today. Massive urbanization, a lot of people seeking to have affordable housing. The problem was that the banks at that time were reluctant to give mortgages because these people weren't seen as a safe people to lend to. So something was developed by the government called the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And what it did at first is not so interesting, I think, to the kingdom because you've got similar organizations. What it did at first is it started lending. But the government can only lend so much. What it really wanted to do is get the private sector into lending, but the confidence wasn't there. So just an idea I wanted to respectfully drop to the advisors and the government and the regulators and everyone involved in studying the housing issue here is the next thing that they did. So in the 1940s and going into the 50s, they provided the financing. And what they also did is they demanded a fairly high down payment. And if you couldn't afford a down payment, they had a separate part of the government that would provide subsidies and other things to help that 5 or 10 or 15%. But the bulk of the people who wanted to have a loan, they provided that financing. To get the banks involved, what they did is they started a mortgage insurance company. And the mortgage insurance company was there to say to the banks that every single person in Canada who buys a house at that time and today, their mortgage has to be insured. And what that means to the banks is that if something awful happens to that person goes bankrupt, banks don't want property. They don't want to take the property back. They're not in that business. They want their money back. So the insurance company would repay the bank on behalf of that person. So the mortgage insurance company was there to insure every single mortgage. So all of a sudden, banks were more than happy to get involved in lending. So that in the 60s, the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation got completely out of the lending business because there was ample amount of bankers there willing to lend. And they spent